I used to go up to my local police station. I'd go through Damien's mobile phone accounts, and I'd see recurring mobile phone numbers, and I'd go into the police station and I'd say, these are obviously drug dealers. These are the people he was buying his drugs off. Why don't you go after them? And I used to turn up every couple of weeks with a pile of numbers, and one day the policeman just looked at me and said, Mr. Trimingham, what are you doing? And I said, what do you mean, what am I doing? I'm trying to help you to catch these drug dealers, because these are the ones who are selling the drugs. And he said, yeah, but what are you doing for you? You know, what is this for you? You're very angry, and I understand that anger. And he said, could you perhaps direct your anger in a different way? And I went away and I really thought about that, and I thought, wow, he's right. You know, all I'm doing is driving myself crazy. And every single drug dealer that's on that list, even if he was put in prison, there'd still be 3 more to take the place. And it became more fundamental then. And the other thing that had happened along with that was I realized by talking to different people that he shouldn't have died. That even though he had a heroin dependence, and people do die of overdose, overdoses are preventable. I read his coroner's report, and every single organ in his body was completely healthy. He was 23 years old, and he had the body of an athlete. And it was a fully functioning body 1 minute and gone the next, and gone because of, well, a number of things, but basically because of the system, and the fact that, you know, he gone to an isolated place to use because he didn't want to be seen in public doing it. And, you know, he had a few other things which are also significant, that he'd been that largely abstinent from heroin, and therefore his tolerance was very much reduced. And secondly, he'd also been drinking a lot of alcohol on the day that he died, so his central nervous system was already depressed. But then I read about naloxone, and now that can reverse overdoses, and now even oxygen can reverse overdoses, and that people shouldn't have to die, but they're going to continue to die as long as there's no safe place for them to go and use, intended to, if they do overdose. So I realized that, and then, of course, the other thing that was eating me away was the fact that in the eyes of society and the law, he was a criminal when he died. He was doing something illegal that he could have gone to prison for, and so he's still sort of written off as a no-hoper because he was committing a crime anyway. And also, you know, even to the extent that some religious organizations see using drugs as a sin, and again, you know, your own fault for doing it. And so I just couldn't reconcile this, and I thought, this is terrible. And I was also then starting to talk to other families, of course, and this is after he died, but finding out that some families were not even mentioning the drugs as an issue in the death, even though they died of overdoses. They were too worried about the shame and stigma that comes with it to actually say he died of a drug overdose. I thought that was absolutely shocking, that people had to carry that, not only the grief of the death and the pain of the death, but to actually keep that secret from everybody.
That is profound. So there's the stigma involved with the person who's using drugs, but then for that to carry over after their lives and be imprinted onto parents to have stigma around them, it just seems so perverse.
Exactly, and of course, when all this was happening in Australia was the late 90s, which was when there was a lot of heroin around, a lot of people were dying, a lot of people were getting dependent on it, and and there was a lot of talk. There was a lot of radio talk. There was a lot of media talk, and some people from the community were expressing extreme ideas about how to fix it. Send them to an island, give them all the drugs they want, let them die. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, we are treating drug users like they're lepers, exactly as they used to treat lepers in the old day. You put them out of society, and they have to carry a bloody sign that said unclean, and often the families with them. And I'm thinking to myself, this is exactly the same thing. We've turned these people who essentially have a health issue, but we're dealing with them as if they're criminals, and we're doing the punitive thing rather than the...
Yeah.
And I mean, it wasn't all black, because I was also reading at the same time about what was happening in Europe, particularly in Switzerland and the Netherlands and parts of Germany, where they were adopting different approaches. And so I could see that these places were doing something different, at least. I didn't know whether they would be workable or useful. And so at the first opportunity, I went over and had a look. And I went over with the attitude that if I see something in these treatment programs that I don't like, I'll change my mind. And so I went to Switzerland, and I looked at the heroin prescription trials and the injection facilities, and I just was absolutely gobsmacked by not so much the facilities. I expected them to be what they were, but I was amazed by the attitude of the community there. They just completely accepted them, and
no question. Do you think some communities and countries didn't have to go through the rigmarole of deprogramming themselves from these deeply held false beliefs and narratives around drugs?
I think they'd already done it. I think in Switzerland, for instance, in places like Zurich, they'd had so many drug problems. They'd had what they call needle parks, where you were literally stepping on needles everywhere you went. And I think they just got sick of that. But they're incredibly pragmatic, and they certainly know how to solve problems.
Sure. And
they just took the view, this is a problem, what we're doing isn't working, let's do something else. And so they introduced the prescription heroin program. They've had many referendums since they introduced that program, always been supported by a large majority. There's no more needle parks. When we were in Bern looking for the facility, I actually stopped an 80-plus-year-old nun to ask me the way, and I had to use sign language, and she understood exactly what I was talking about when I was kind of signing a needle, and she just pointed out the building that it was in, and then just continued on her way. There's no condemnation, no judgment. It was just wonderful and just so different from what I was experiencing in Australia from some people. Not everybody, but from some people. And so, I don't think they just decided on these programs overnight and they worked immediately. I think they had to go through the transitions, but it didn't stop them trying them. They were always willing to do something a bit different, and that's what frustrates me about Australia, and I'm sure it's the same in the States. It's this moralistic, religious attitude that people apply, and in the meantime, people are dying and families are suffering as a result of it.
Yeah, I think if you in Australia are anything like us, we can't seem to get out of the black and white between, well, this person is a horrible failure of morality versus this person is destined to be addicted and sick forever, as though there's no gray or sensible third option.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. And it's interesting. We often talk to couples who are struggling with drug issues in their family, and often the two parents will take an opposite view of how to deal with it. The father will often be the hardline, tough love problem solver, and the female will be the soft line rescuer over a responsible person who wants to keep everything in order. And they're actually creating a war between themselves often in how to deal with it, which eventually ends in a win-lose situation rather than a win-win situation. So spend a lot of time educating families that the hardliners have to soften up and become more flexible, and the softliners have to put a few more boundaries in place and not be so over-involved, and working together as a team rather than in opposition. And that generally works out a lot better in the long run for the family.
Everything about this sounds really practical and reasonable, and we don't exactly have that in spades here in the U.S. Are there many programs like yours in Australia, or is yours somewhat unique?
And I don't think there was a service like ours until we started. There were other models of support.
Right.
Tough love was one of them, the American idea of tough love, the 12 steps. And I'm not negative about 12 steps. I do believe that there's a place for it, and it does help a lot of people. But it certainly wasn't what I wanted. And then there's another codependency model which says the family's to blame, therefore we need to fix the family first. That model didn't work for me either. So there were other sort of services available, but not that I particularly liked, and it didn't fit the model of therapy that I'd been involved in for several years. So I tried to bring across what basically the ideas of Carl Rogers, which is, self-efficacy, client-centered, empowerment. And the other thing that was happening at the time we started was that the idea of motivational interviewing as a psychological model was becoming more and more used. So that fitted well as well. So to get back to your question, there's been some services started since we started that are similar to ours. I still think we are different, and I still think we're the best because we've seen the results in literally thousands of families, and we're now spreading around the world. We've got people interested in New Zealand, we've got people interested in the UK, in Japan, and of course working closely with Carol Bayer in New Jersey and New York. It's starting to get a foothold there, and I think Carol is the person to carry it forward in the States. Families are struggling there. I know that because I've met many of them, and I'm sure that given resources, which is critical, and time, and the people, and Carol's got quite a lot of people behind her who are excellent, it will get off the ground there. I wish I was 40 years younger because I'd be moving to the States. I think I could do some good work there, but I think it'll be up to Carol, and she will be able to do that.